gaps in their content. We need to allow for that possibility, although most scholars would be of the view that that's probably reasonably minimal at certain stages. But certainly in terms of their interpretation or their meaning. That as they were told, they lost contact with their original intention and meaning in the ministry of Jesus, and they were stories that were connected much more explicitly to the life and the experience of the church. Now, one particular form, then, of that problem relates to the question of the form of the parable and the interpretation of it. And this is to do with really the way in which scholarship has developed in the modern period, and the kind of swings of the pendulum that happen in such scholarly movements. Many of you will be aware that throughout much Christian history and tradition, the interpretation, particularly of story parables, was characterized by a mode of interpretation that we know of as allegory. Yeah? Historical critical commentators are fond of pointing out the most extreme versions of this kind of allegorical reading, where every aspect of the story has an equivalent aspect in the interpretation. So every aspect of the story has an equivalent aspect in the interpretation. So there are famously interpretations of the Good Samaritan by St. Augustine that argue that the two coins that the Samaritan gives to the innkeeper to look after, those two coins represent the two sacraments. Right? So every detail of the story. So you get the notion that allegory says that if in the parable we have A, B, C, D, we have four elements. In the interpretation of the parable, each of these, I'm going to run out of letters here, and 0. Each of these elements must have an equivalent interpretation. This is allegorical detail. Okay? Modern scholarship has been largely pretty suspicious of that view. And has instead developed a reading of parables where the focus is not on the many points of equivalence, but on the one single point that together the details of the story establish. So we have the notion that together points A, B, C and D make 1 point and 1 point only. And this, of course, is to connect the story parables, where there are many points, much more obviously with the one-line parables, where there aren't lots of points, there's only ever one. So, I don't know how much names are helpful to you, but the name of the scholar who kind of developed this to the most significant extent in a work that's unfortunately not been ever translated is Adolf Ulicker. And then in the classic period of 20th century scholarship, Joachim Jeremias and C.H. Dodd in their books on the parables, both of which are in English. Okay? And this became known as the kind of one-point interpretation. For every parable, we're looking for 1 point. And the argument goes here that a parable like the parable of the sower, in the ministry of Jesus, made 1 point. But the church allegorized it. Does that make sense? Yeah. So in the interpretation we get in Mark, we have the church's allegorization of a story that only really was about one thing and one thing alone. So we'll talk about that in relation to the details as we go through. Okay, any questions then about this, just general stuff about parables? We can take just a few minutes of that to go through before we kick off. Yeah, Andrew.
Yeah, so you're saying that one parable would be just 1 point, but the church has made that parable many different interpretations.
And we've got 2 parables in our chapter where we'll see the process of not 1 point interpretation, but numerous points interpretation happening. The sower and the parable of the tares or the weeds. And I'll argue that the parable of the sower possibly reflects an interpretation that may well have been Jesus' intention anyway, even if Jesus never gave the explanation. The interpretation, however, of the parable of the weeds very much looks like Matthew saying, okay, I've got 7 points in this parable. There are characters, there's a setting, there's a... Okay, this equals this, this equals this, this equals this. We'll see it very clearly. Okay. So on books on the historical Jesus, you will very often find historical Jesus scholars trying to strip away the layers of the church's interpretation to see if we can get back to the interpretation of the story in the original ministry of Jesus. Yeah.
As a general rule, when they work through those detailed points, do they come to the same conclusion?
About the meaning?
A
related...
One meaning?
One meaning? No. No, of course they don't, because parables are ambiguous and the ambiguity means... So part of it means that... we'll see this with the parable of the leaven, which is a good example. The parable of the leaven is so brief that to get any meaning from it, what you clearly need to do is to bring in material from somewhere else to fill in the picture. So the question is, well, where do you bring the other stuff from? Do you bring it from Jesus' Jewish world, from apocalyptic writings, from rabbinic sources, from other parts of the New Testament? The different way in which you might do it will shape and reshape. There's some agreement about some aspects of it, and we'll talk about those in relation to one or two details. Yeah.
But in one of the Gospel, Jesus actually interpreted the parable.
Yep.
Say the parable of the sower.
Yeah.
So are you saying it's more the Gospel writer interpreting it than Jesus saying it?
So I'm saying that it's possible. We need to allow for the possibility that the way the parables have been preserve not only the original interpretation may have been lost, and they're preserved alongside with the later church's interpretation. Now, some scholars would argue that that goes far enough to say that the interpretations that we get here were never the interpretations that Jesus gave. So some scholars would be radical enough to say that. In the two examples we have here, I'm going to say that in the first example, I think that's probably to that's to overstretch a claim. But in the second example, it seems to me that that's pretty clear that that's what's happened. And actually, Matthew has written the interpretation himself and placed it on the lips of Jesus. But I'll tell you why I think that when we get to it.
Sean, can you say again, previously you mentioned about the foreground and the background.
Yeah.
About being positive and negative.
Yeah.
Can you repeat a little
Just
bit?
repeat it. So this is this theme of judgment in Matthew and future eschatological judgment, which quite clearly has two sides. There are two sides to the notion of judgment. This is standard prophetic traditions. The prophetic books of the Old Testament are made up of oracles that combine judgment and promises of salvation. And you read some Old Testament prophets. So let's take Old Testament prophets as a counterpoint. If you read a prophet like Amos and ask, if you were to kind of draw Amos's scene of what God will do when God shows up, what's at the front? The stuff that's so in your face that you can't avoid it. The stuff to which your eye is drawn. Okay? And in Amos it's negative. Amos is a judgment prophet. It really is, significant judgment with salvation oracles at the end. And if you've done Old Testament studies, you know that one of the questions in prophetic study is, what's the relationship between judgment oracles and salvation oracles? Right? In Matthew's scene, if you were to portray it, the question is, what is the eye of the audience drawn to? What's at the foreground for you? And I'm suggesting that I think that Matthew understands, and you'll see this when you get to chapters 21, 22, 24, 25, and it's to do with this call to decision, the third point. Matthew's intention here is to say, I'm not telling you these stories as a description of the fact that all your enemies will be punished. I'm telling this story to you because by understanding these stories, you can understand what the invitation to discipleship consists of, why it is that entering the kingdom or walking by the narrow way or